Hello. Promotional Products Association International is pleased to present the online educational program, Multi-Generational Leadership, Aligning the Stars Across Generations. My name is William Poole, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Please note today's webinar is being recorded, and all participant phone lines will be muted during this broadcast. Today's presentation will last approximately 60 minutes. You may submit a question or comment at any time during today's presentation using the Q&A window on the lower right-hand panel of your screen. Immediately following today's webinar, your screen will be directed to an online survey. Completing this short survey will allow PPAI to continuously improve our webinars and better meet your needs. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Beth Miller. Beth Miller is a certified management coach, an accomplished entrepreneur, blogger, and speaker on leadership and team-related topics. She is a founder and president of Executive Velocity Incorporated, a leadership development and talent management advisory firm for fast-growing and small to mid-sized companies. Miller has worked in marketing for Bell South, SunTrust, the American Cancer Society, and Wachovia, and she has been featured in Software Advice, Smart Briefs, and Leadership Blog at HR.com and One-to-One Magazine. Without further ado, I give you Beth.
Thank you so much, and I am very excited to be working with you over the next hour. Before I start, I just wanted to kind of give you some context around where this presentation came from. I've been coaching and working with small business owners and executives for about 10 years now, and about 2 or 3 years ago, I started hearing conversations and grumblings around the Gen Y, or millennial generation. I heard things like, well, they don't get it, they're lazy, they want to work from home, they need all sorts of recognition, and I kind of stepped back and I thought, gosh, everybody has gifts and talents, and a generation is millions of people. And as I started having the opportunity to meet a lot of Gen Yers, I realized that many of them did not fit the mold of what I was hearing. So I put this presentation together to really help leaders understand, first and foremost, that every employee is an individual. They may be part of a generation and be influenced from their generation, but first and foremost, they're an individual. So today, I want to first talk a little bit about the generations, who they are, what influences, and from a historical standpoint, who they are, and their preferences and values. And then we'll talk more about tailoring your leadership. How do you, as a leader, manager, make adjustments both from a leadership perspective as well as a workplace perspective that benefits all? And then we'll talk about team impact and get into some specific exercises that you can use in your organization that will help bridge that gap. The goal is really about building multi-generational teams so that we value each other and leverage both the differences and similarities within generations. And with that, we are going to open up our first poll. So what generation are you from? There's currently 4 in the workplace: Traditionalists, Baby Boomer, Gen X, and then Gen Y or Millennials. I want to get a sense of our audience. And we are quickly moving here. Got some Baby Boomers like myself, some Gen Xers. Still have not received some folks' answers. Got about 50% of you right now that have answered. And kind of slowing down here. We've got about 20 seconds left. This is an interesting, very interesting here. Okay. So I will close the poll in 10 seconds. All right. Some of you just don't want to answer. All right. So I have got a little bit of a technical issue here, so I apologize. It looks like we have, according to all of you, nobody in the traditionalist box, baby boomers of 32%, Gen Xers of 27%, and Gen Yers of 7%. Now, if you look at the actual percentages here, you'll see that we're pretty much right on target from a standpoint of traditionalists. And the baby boomers are pretty much on target. Really what's a little off from a standpoint of the group that we're talking to today is the Gen Yers or Millennials. And these are the folks that are 33 or less in age, and they are the ones that are really going to fill that gap from a leadership management standpoint as the baby boomers start to retire. They're already retiring, but there's not enough Gen Xers out there to fill that gap. So that's something, if you're a small organization, that you need to really be considering from a succession planning standpoint. How do you, if you've got those Gen Yers, how do you get them to be ready for management and leadership? That's just kind of a side note. So what really has influenced the generations? I mentioned earlier in our the very first slide that we've got millions of people in each generation. You know, the baby boomers are 77 million and Gen Yers are 80 million. But there is also the fact that those are made up of individuals. Those generations are made up of individuals, and each individual has personal experiences that have helped to mold us, as well as historical points in history that we as within a specific generation have lived through. So let's talk about those historical events. And there aren't any traditionalists in the group, at least that are willing to admit it. But the traditionalists, there are still those individuals who are in the workforce that grew up through the Great Depression and World War II. From a communication standpoint, they relied on radio and newspapers to get their news. TV, when they were growing up, wasn't really that common. Long-distance phone calls were expensive, and air travel was very limited. One of the things that traditionalists are known for is their survival methods. They're very resilient because of these historical events that they grew up in. Then you've got the boomers, and the boomers, they have a wide range from a standpoint of when they were born and growing up. If you think about it, I'm actually on the tail end of the boomers. So, for instance, civil rights in the Vietnam War, I don't remember that much of, because I was really too young to really understand what was going on there. Obviously, I did have the opportunity to grow up with television, and I do remember the landing on the moon. But there were other things, too, that boomers really experienced. There was the assassinations of JFK and Martin Luther King, which has influence. There was Woodstock. All of those events impact kind of what we value, and one of those is dedication and team commitment. It's also about hard work, and we tend not to have as much balance in our lives as the younger generations. The Gen Xers, very different things historically that they grew up. Desert Storm, that was essentially the first war that we could see in real time. MTV, I mean, when I grew up, television we had 3 or 4 stations. All of a sudden, we have the Gen Xers had a raft of information that was available to them through cable television. The Berlin Wall came down. AIDS became a serious health issue. One of the other things was the draft was eliminated. So all of a sudden, you have a generation who weren't required to go into the military. So the previous generations grew up much more with an influence around command and control type of leadership. Gen Xers also had personal computers. And the other influence that was pretty significant with Gen Xers was the first generation that grew up with both parents working. And they were called kind of the lock key generation, where they would come home to an empty house and didn't get as much recognition and one-on-one time with their parents. This is the generation that many Gen Yers are coming from. And thus, Gen Yers are really looking for a lot of attention because that's what was given to them by their parents. Gen Xers, really getting back to them, they value work-life balance. They value freedom and autonomy. And then the Gen Yers, well, gosh, they grew up in a time of rapid change. They grew up with the internet, social media, but they also have entered into the workforce during or after the Great Recession. And so they are looking for, when they find work, if it's meaningful work, they will stick around. If it isn't, they're basically leasing or renting their job, and they will look for other opportunities. So you will see Gen Yers move more rapidly from one job to another, unless that position really speaks to them. So one of the questions, and this is not something that you need to answer, but I would like you to be thinking about is, what events have contributed to you and your filters as a leader? And these events could be historical, but they could also be personal. So I remember I mentioned military service. Well, if you're somebody who served country overseas during time of war, that could be a lot more significant than just living through the history of a war. There could be other personal things that would contribute to your filters as a leader. Death of a parent at an early age, that may influence how you lead. There might be a teacher or mentor that had a positive influence in you, on you rather. I was talking to a leader recently who shared with me one of his experiences that really impacted how he leads today. Very early on, he was on the fast track for a large organization in finance and accounting, and he was asked to be part of a board meeting. He had a mentor in the CFO who really believed in him. And what he experienced during that meeting was that the people in the meeting, and he was told that he was only to speak if a question was asked. So he sat there very quietly and just observed and listened. And what he found and heard was that these individuals at the board level really had no idea what was going on in the organization. So fast forward, when he became CEO of his company, one of the first things he remembered was that day sitting in the board meeting. And he implemented a Friday lunches with Tom. And he would invite those individuals kind of on the ground floor that really, really understood what was going on in the organization just to have lunch with him. Now, it took, what he told me was probably about 6 months for people to really trust that they could share with him that nothing was going to get back to his leadership team. But what it did was it provided him with much better information moving forward when significant decisions were made, that he could ask some leading questions of leaders that potentially would get them to think about things in a different way based on information he had obtained. So think about those events that have contributed to your leadership. And then, how could they impact your leadership style? So generational preferences, and these are things that are referenced on this sheet, which you have available to you. I have members and executive teams use this oftentimes for really understanding the preferences that individuals have, but remembering that these are groups and that, again, individuals themselves might be outside of these specific explanations, like a traditionalist with little need for performance management, and all they need is an annual performance. I'm going to be referencing this as we move forward, and so I wanted you to see this, because as we get further into the presentation, we're going to be talking about some exercises that will help you as a leader bring and bridge the gap of the generational differences. So if we get back to the presentation, there are kind of two areas as a leader that you need to be thinking about. One is the work environment and how generational preferences play in. So those things would be, for instance, when people have to work, where they have to work, the actual environment that they're working in. And then the other is the management style and communications that you use as a leader amongst and across the various generations. So I think I've said this a number of times. It's really important that you don't group everybody into one generation, and that you really think about the individual preferences as well as the generational preferences. And this is where, if you don't use an assessment tool such as a Myers-Briggs or a DISC, or even another one, StrengthsFinders, all three pretty well known, I would highly recommend that this be part of your management of individuals, and then when we get into the generational exercises, really understanding that there are individuals and they have specific preferences. So we're going to get to the next poll. And the question is, from your perspective, what is the most common conflict between generations within the workplace? You have 3 choices, and we will open the poll now, and you can choose from one of those 3 as the most common. Well, people have jumped in a lot quicker on this one. Okay, we've got about 20 people that have not yet responded. Got 30 seconds. All right. This is very interesting. All right, we've got 20 seconds. Things have slowed down here in response. All right, I am going to close the poll now. And so we have got, for performance management, only 6%, communications at 27%, and work styles at 35%. And then we've got a number of folks that chose not to participate. So the communications and work styles, I would say, generally are the top 2, although performance management generally is much higher than the 6%. And that gets to kind of the rewards and recognition aspect, and those are things from a recognition standpoint that Gen Yers, they want a lot more frequent recognition and praise than a boomer. And rewards are different as well. For instance, a traditionalist really is looking for much more tangible symbols. They're looking for the watch or the service plaque, whereas like a Gen Xer, they would much prefer to have some extra time off because of the whole work-life balance. is more important to them. If you gave them a plaque, that probably would not go over very well. So let's talk about some more common areas of conflict. I talked about the work environment, and choosing when and where to work is obviously one of those. Gen Yers don't look at or even say, I'm going to work. They don't have a defined place for work, and a lot of that has to do with technology. They grew up in an age of the internet and social media and PDAs and tablets that they can work anywhere and feel very comfortable working anywhere. But yet, if you had a traditionalist or many boomers, they look at work as in a defined space. And that could be their home office or their corporate office or cube, but it's defined. The next one, which is probably the most obvious, is communication among team members. Now, we generally kind of think about this conflict from a standpoint of the channels of communication. So if you think about it, face-to-face conversation would be much more preferable to a traditionalist or a boomer than a Gen Yer who's wanting to text. But it also goes deeper than that, and that is kind of the verbiage. If you think about how quickly our language is changing, that can cause some conflict as well, because a word to a traditionalist may mean something entirely different than to a Gen Yer. Common one, for instance, is gay. Well, to a traditionalist, that's very different than what we know gay is today. An interesting one is spam. Some of you know that, especially if you're from Hawaii, that spam can be a food, meat in a can. But to a Gen X or Gen Yer, they probably have never heard of that. So be careful about the words that you use, and make sure that everybody understands the definitions of words when you are working across generations. Planning and scheduling. Gosh, older workers really like to have an agenda. It's planned. It's on a specific day, specific time, in a specific place. But yet the younger workers are a lot more spontaneous. They will get together when they think they need to get together. And that can cause conflict as well. And then finally, kind of the accessing information and learning. The whole idea of how individuals within these generations learn is very different. The traditionalists and boomers will like the traditional classroom. They will want it to be informational. The Gen Xers and Millenials, they're very much, getting them to sit in a room for a full day would be extremely difficult to keep their attention span. So they're much more about short segments of information, and they want it to be personalized and customized to their needs. So you really need to be delivering the learning in a way that they can connect quickly with their job and what they need to do. So those are some areas that you need to be aware of when you are in a team of multi-generations. So we're now going to talk about tailoring your management specifically across generations. Now, I talked about, we've already kind of gotten into the communications aspect, that it's not just about the actual delivery mechanism, but it's about the verbiage, and it's also around frequency and length. The older generations don't require multiple communications for the same message, but yet the younger generations want more frequency, but the length of the communications need to be short and concise because you're going to lose them otherwise. Performance management, although few of you brought this up as a conflict, you really need to be aware of the fact that within performance management, recognition and rewards are going to be critical to managing the various generations. And so referring back to the overview that I showed you earlier, I would highly recommend that you take a look at how you recognize and reward various individuals on your team and think about it from the perspective of what generation they're in, but also think about it from a perspective of individually who they are. For instance, there are some people, and it has nothing to do with their generation, but their individual preferences, wouldn't want to be recognized in a big group. That's just not comfortable to them. But to be recognized one-on-one or maybe in a small team environment would be fine. So you really need to understand what's going to motivate the individuals and also understand from a standpoint of the generations the rewards aspect as well. So performance management is really the recognition and rewards part, but it's also the incremental communications that you're going to have with the individual. The Gen Y is going to want a lot more feedback and direction. They're going to want to know whether or not they're accomplishing what they need to accomplish on a quicker time frame than a baby boomer or Gen Xer. So now let's kind of look at how to leverage the generations to really increase performance in your organization. I know many of you are from smaller organizations, so that every team member is really, really important from a productivity standpoint. And what I would say is first of all, you need to create an environment of learning and teaching amongst each other and be able to appreciate the differences of each generation as well as the individuals within those generations. Then you have the opportunity to create some exercises that will be able to bridge the knowledge and understanding amongst the various generations. So I have got one last poll question, just to get a sense of whether or not your organization already has some type of training or team building programs addressing the multi-generations. So you basically have three options here, and if you could, I've opened the poll. If you could answer this question, that would be very helpful. All right. Got about 50 seconds left. About half of you have already responded. Oh, it's interesting. Slowing down right now, and we got about 20 seconds left. And it looks like it's pretty evenly between yes and no right now, with a few unsures. And for those that are unsure, I would, and if this is really important to you, I would reach out to your training or HR department to determine if in fact there is something already out there. Okay. All right, so the yeses are at 24%, no's are 24 as well, and unsures are 14, and then a number of you decided not to vote. So for those of you who have answered yes, at the end of this presentation, if there are things that you have done in the past that aren't part of what I'm going to talk about today, I'd be really interested in learning more about the exercises that you folks have tried and what's worked for you. So we're going to get into the first exercise, what I call kind of finding connections and similarities. Now, this would require a group with at least 2 generations represented. And it's designed to help understand both the individual as well as their generation. So what you would do is you would have the generational preferences overview as part of the handout. And you would partner with employees into pairs from different generations. You then have each individual review the generational preferences that represent their generation and determine really whether or not they agree or not with the generational statements on the spreadsheet. And then if they disagree with something, to really explain why you disagree with that with your partner. And then the next step would be to explore where you are like with the other person. So, for instance, you could have a traditionalist and a millennial paired up. And the older generation would state that he likes frequent recognition, contrary to what the spreadsheet says. And suddenly you have something in common with the Gen Y-er. And then discuss the impact that the individual has when this preference is not being met in the workplace. And then what you do is you would bring back the pairs to, as a group and have a conversation around what you learned from each other and what could you learn as a group. The next exercise requires a bigger group, although the group shouldn't be larger than 15. And this is where you provide the group with a scenario. And one scenario that I've used is really around communications. And the scenario would be that one individual is invited to join an existing team at your company because of the technical expertise that you have. And the team is responsible for creating a new technology platform that's really critical to your company. And the project is behind schedule. So you're introduced to your team members and then asked by the team leader to be responsible for the notes of the meeting. And after the scenario is given, then you have a set of questions that you ask the group, where the questions are answered individually first and not shared with a group. And the questions are things like, what questions would you have before starting to take notes? And how do you plan to draft the notes? Or is there any technology that you'd use? How would you distribute the notes, and whom would you distribute them to? And then you'd split the groups into generations and ask the group to discuss their individual preferences and then bring the group back together to determine if there are any themes within each generation regarding things like technology and communications. There are others out there like that, but the whole idea is to really understand that diversity amongst a group is good. It brings out a lot of great ideas and options, but you need to understand first where each individual group is coming from. The next one is creating mentor pairs. And this is where you actually create a cross-generational mentor program. So you would pair a Gen X with a boomer, for instance. And these are two common areas. The technology and communication, again, is two areas where you can bridge gaps. The communications, the boomers and traditionalists could mentor younger generations on basically face-to-face communications and presenting in a group, whereas the Gen Xers and Yers could mentor the older generations on technology, social media, and internet, specific areas and skills that they have that would be of value to the group. All right, so we have gone through 3, and we have got one last suggestion, and that's to identify best practices. And this one might not be one that would be as helpful to some of you because of the smaller organizations that you're in. But the larger organizations, I would go and look for success stories in your organizations where the multi-generations work really effectively together by leveraging their differences. You know, are there specific individuals who aren't typical to their generation, who others can learn from. Those would be best practices that you could potentially bring in to your team. Now, if you're from a smaller organization, there might be other ways of kind of finding those best practices, and those could be things like industry associations and networks into larger companies. You might have vendors that would be able to share best practices with. So those would be my recommendations for if you're unable to find best practices within your organization. So, as a wrap-up, and then I will take questions, generations are groups of millions, and they aren't individuals. So when you're dealing with a multi-generational team, it's not just about understanding the generations, but understanding those individual preferences. And those individual preferences you can learn more about through assessments like Myers-Briggs or DISC. Then the next is that, all generations need attention. It's not just the Gen Yers. And understanding kind of how they need attention and when they need attention is really important. And then finally, generations can learn from each other if you as a leader really put in place the work environment and the management techniques that allow them to learn from each other, and ultimately your team will be a lot more successful. And then just one last thing, and that is that generational shift is coming. There were a few Gen Yers on the call today, but there will be much more Gen Yers in the workforce and moving up into the leadership roles, so that there is this generational shift that's already taking place from a leadership perspective as well. So you really need to prepare for that. And I want to kind of leave you with a question, and that is, what assumptions do you make about specific generations that actually lead to team conflict? We identified what the team conflict was. Think about those assumptions, be aware of those assumptions, and work towards really understanding the real situation versus your assumptions. And with that, I would welcome questions. People can chat, raise their hand. And I have, there we go, hold on a second. Okay, somebody would like to have the spreadsheet that you saw in the document. That is available on my website, which is www.executive-velocity.com, which I will move right there. It's under the Tools section. It's free. Just it's a PDF. You can download it. Okay. Let's see here. We got anybody else? I had somebody who tried to ask a question, but he didn't get anything there. Well, if there's no additional questions, I think we can wrap up. okay, hold on. Some of the issues are the continual web surfing and doing personal business during the workday. Yes. So here's the thing with the web surfing and personal business during the day. That is something that is around kind of the accountability. And if you've got individuals who are kind of project-based and they're getting their project done, then the only thing that I see as an issue is if this web surfing and personal business is taking place and in a way that is causing them not to meet their project deadlines, and if it's so blatant that it's impacting others. So if you've got a culture where everybody's doing it, well, that's one situation. But if you've got, one or two people that are doing it and it's going against kind of counterculture to your organization, then you need to have the conversation of, and this would be what I would call the coaching conversation, where you would ask questions of the individual to get them to understand the impact it is having on others around them. Because I can guarantee you, if you've got, if it's open enough and blatant enough, you get other people who are getting frustrated, just not yourself. And you need to have that kind of critical or crucial conversation with that individual to get them to understand that it's being noticed, and that you understand that they're meeting their deadlines, et cetera, but that it can't be so blatant that others are basically getting annoyed at what's happening. Good question. Any other questions? Let's see here. I don't see any other questions. If any of you have questions after this, you see my email, and I'd be happy to answer questions via email as well. All right, Lori?
Yes, this is what, yes. All right, thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
We want to offer our special thing.
I got something. What was the sheet called?
Go ahead.
What was the sheet called that pointed the differences between the generations? It is called the Generational Preferences Overview. All right. Back to you.
We'd like to offer a special thanks to our speaker, Beth Miller, for sharing her expertise today. Today's webinar is copyrighted and all rights reserved by Promotional Products Association International. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for your participation.
And thank you all.